Welcome to How to Create a New Daz Studio Custom Creature Session 2, presented by Shaylin Hamar. And this webinar is copyright 2018 Digital Art Live and Shaylin Hamar, Sickle Yield. So welcome again to this part 2, and if everyone can give their continued support and another warm welcome for Shaylin as we start in this second session.
Here we are in Daz Studio with our gecko that we rigged up yesterday with the mouth shut. Now, in order to texture this, I'm going to go back to Blender where I created it. And you'll see that in Blender here, I have a version with the mouth open. And I'm actually going to create another version yet for texturing, because if you recall from yesterday, the eyeballs are on a separate UV map from the rest of the body. So I'm going to actually separate those right now and texture them separately. I will have saved a separate version of this so that I don't make this a permanent change, but there are the eyeballs. So I'm going to export those separately here to wavefront/obj, and I'm going to call that, there we go, SYGecko eyes. And then I have the rest of the body here with no eyes in it, and that contains the rest of the UV map here. As I discussed yesterday, the UV map is broken up quite a bit here because I prioritized lack of stretching over minimum of seams. To get minimum of seams, Blender is a more difficult program to use. ZBrush is actually a little better at that. UV mapping in ZBrush has its own challenges, so it just depends on what program you end up being more comfortable with of those available to you when it comes to something like the UV mapping. But for now, I'm going to export the gecko. I might even drag the mouth open a little further for ease of texturing here. Hang on. I'm just going to use the proportional edit here in Blender and make sure, I need to make sure I have mirror turned off and drag that down. And then I can see the bottom of the tongue. I can see pretty much all parts of the mouth. I can see the inside of the eye sockets. Okay, so I'm ready to export that. Oh yes, and I want to have both eyes closed. I almost forgot about that. In this case, usually visibility of the inside of the eye sockets is a little less important because the user will almost never see the inside of the eye socket, but they will see the outside of the eyelid relatively often. So I'm going to want to generally have eyes closed, mouth open is the rule. Maybe even allow a little gap there to ensure that I texture all of the edges of the eye socket there. I mean of the eyelid, like that. So eyes closed, mouth open. I might even bend the feet down in some circumstances. In Genesis 8 Female, I usually raise the arms up higher and move the legs apart further to ensure that all parts of the skin are accessible for texturing purposes. So now I've got my shut-eyed, gape-mouthed gecko here. I'm going to export that as well. And I'll call that Gecko for Substance Painter. And I'll export that. So then I'm ready to look at texturing. I'm going to go to Substance Painter and File and New. And then I will choose Select. And I'll navigate to where I exported my gecko. I'm going to paint at 2048 actually because it's going to be a relatively small creature. You're usually going to want to do 4096, or if your system can handle it, even bigger if you're working with something like a human being. But 2048 is big enough for a tiny creature or most clothing actually. There we go. It's important to remember that making it bigger doesn't make it better unless you're specifically adding enough small detail to make it worth it. Okay, there is my gecko, just like that. So I'm ready to think about starting to paint it. Over here on the right, you can see my layers dialog, just like a 2D program like Photoshop or any other program would have. And to the right of that, you can see it's called the texture set list, but these are my materials, the base, the mouth, and the tongue. So that's ready to have my normal map sculpted for it. I'll go ahead and sculpt a normal map first in Blender and then in ZBrush so that you can see some of the options here. Since I've already got this here all divided out, I can then go to the Add Modifier panel and add not a subdivision surface, but a multi-resolution modifier. And what this does is allow me to subdivide and increase the resolution here. You can see it got smoother as I increased the resolution. And the preview needs to be low when we start baking. Preview is just what it shows in the viewport. I want it to be higher while I'm actually sculpting the gecko here. I might even go as high as 3. That makes it about 330,000, 34,000 faces. Blender should still be able to handle that. Blender doesn't go up to 1,000,000 very well when it comes to sculpts, but this should do it. So the reason that I want to have a normal map separate from just the regular texturing is, here I got some source pictures here. Leopard geckos are kind of wrinkly and knobbly. You can see they have all these wrinkles and folds of skin on their bodies, especially visible on the whiter parts, but generally they do. And the other thing is, look at the gecko's back. The sides of the gecko, all the sides of the legs, the sides of the main body, the sides of the head, and the sides of the tail, all of them have these little knobbly dots. The gecko also has, let's see, there's a good side view of some of the wrinkling and knobbling there. And it has these ridges on the tail that would have been too high poly to model in, so I'm probably going to add those to that map also. And then, let me see, there's a difference between source pictures and reference pictures. This is my reference folder. The reference pictures are just from Google. Those can't legally be used to paint from. But I've got these source pictures also that I got from like Morguefile and Pixabay that I can legally use to paint directly onto the model, which I'll be showing you how I do that in Instance Painter. But it's possible to do it in Blender too, I think. Okay, here's a tympanum, this ear hole right here. Because lizards don't have an external ear. Instead, they have a hole and a membrane. So I'm going to create the tympanum in my sculpt as well. And probably also the nostrils. I didn't model nostrils into it. So to start with, we're going to start with the tympanum and nostrils and then propagate out to some of these smaller details like this. So the tympanum here is, I measure for it from the edge of the jaw here, like the edge of where the mouth ends. It's very close to where the mouth ends on the side of the jaw, well behind the eye, and sort of right on that hump there where the head doesn't quite become a neck. So I'm going to go to sculpt mode in Blender, and I'm going to make sure that my symmetry is on, and I'm going to use inflate deflate and set it to deflate and front faces only. That just ensures that it doesn't propagate my sculpt to the other side of the mesh by accident. So I'm going to go in here. Okay, there's that hump, there's the eye, and there's the mouth. So the tympanum needs to go back in this area right here. Just going to make a deep divot in the surface. Like that. And I might even inflate the edges a little bit around that, because if we look at our reference picture, you can also see that the gecko's got a sort of a lumpy ridge around the tympanum there to sort of direct sound waves into the membrane. So I might even lump that up a little bit around the edge there. Okay, there's a tympanum. It's on both sides. Deepen the hole even a little bit, like that. And then for the nostrils, I'm going to try and, again, look at where they are in proportion to the other facial features. They sort of face out to the sides, but they're pretty close to the very tip of the nose there. A lot of these geckos, you'll notice that these are leopard geckos, so a lot of them actually have sort of a little line pointing right from the eye to where the nostril goes. So I look at this right here and I can say there's the eye, draw a line, nostril probably goes right about here. And the nostril's pretty round compared to what the tympanum looks like. Again, I remember Paul asking yesterday if you agonize over making your sculpt or your mesh look as much as possible like your reference creature, and the answer is absolutely yes, because now we're looking in detail at the appearance of a real creature. So this can take a very long time, and the result that I get today will not be as nice as it would be if I were making a product, because I would be spending more time on it than I have today. But I've indented my nostril with deflate. I will make a little ring around it with inflate to delineate its position very clearly there. There we go. And then I'm ready to look at making some little bumps. There are some different ways to do that. Let me see if I can do a spaced stroke here. I don't think Blender gives me that option, but before I say that for sure, let me check. Stroke. Okay, here's a stroke method, spacing 10%. If I say 100%, look at that. It lets me make a very nice line of dots. Good job, Blender. So I didn't actually know it could do that until today. Wonderful. So I'm going to use my bracket keys to enlarge or shrink my brush here, and I can just draw this nice line of dots here, and I'm holding down my mouse and going back and forth across it to amplify those dots as I go, to give more the appearance of those knobbly dots that the gecko has on the sides of it. And I can increase my spacing on the next line and make them bigger to sort of try and get more of the impression that the actual gecko has, or even to randomize a little bit on the size of them. Just like that. And then I will put some smaller ones, decrease the spacing again here, and I'll run some smaller ones at a pretty high level of strength up here. This is the strength dial. I can, up at the top of the brush dialog here. Yes, Paul's saying, any questions on the modeling/sculpting you've seen so far? I can certainly cover that as I'm just adding bumps to the limbs of the gecko.
So Liana asks, does sculpting increase the polys, or does it just work with what is available?
In this case, in Blender, with the method that I'm using, sculpting just works with what's available. You weren't here when I added the multi-resolution modifier. That's over here on the right in Blender on the modifier panel, add modifier, multi-resolution. And then I subdivided 3 times. So the original gecko has about 4,000 polygons, but the subdivided version that I'm working with has about 330,000. Blender tends to lag in the million poly area, which is why I was going to use ZBrush, but more people can't afford ZBrush yet, so we're gonna do it with Blender, and I may also demonstrate the ZBrush version if people want that as well further along. So in either case, Liana, the answer is that, oh, Ted says, can the brush be customized? Could I create a brush like a question mark? Yes, you can. I will show you how to do that, in fact. Here in Blender, in the Tools panel, under Sculpt and Brush, down here there is a thing that says Texture. It accepts things like JPEG and PNG. I don't think that it accepts PSD format, but let me check. To do that, you'll notice there's nothing really here except these body ones that I used on another project. To add one, you need to go to the Textures panel, which looks like a checked square. And I'm going to hit New there. And you'll notice that there's actually an option here for this dropdown that says Brush. There's Texture, and under Image, I can open any image from my computer. Let me find one of my 3D coat brushes for scales, actually, because I have several. I know there were, oh no, I've actually moved some to my Gecko webinar folder to use today. Let me see. Scale grouping 03, that's right. Let's see if Blender will actually paint with this or not. I hand drew this. You can actually paint from a projected image directly onto the creature, but that's best used for diffuse texturing. It's not optimal for sculpting. For sculpting, you want nice clear edges to the individual scales, so that's why I made this. Let's see. Oh, it's already, and you'll notice it's already picked it up over here on the sculpt panel. So let's see what that looks like by default. I've set the spacing, with the spacing the way I have, it doesn't look quite right. Let's see what we've got here. I'm going to set the sculpt to sculpt draw, leave it to add and front faces. And then let's see. I'm going to try stencil mode here and see what that does. Oh, this is just like Substance Painter's stencil mode. Well, that's useful. Okay, so with stencil mode, I'll drag this around to the back right here, and then it paints the shape based on that stencil. So now we have that rough configuration of scales. The subdivision isn't quite big enough to create a scale pattern, which is why I was going to do that. I'm going to do that differently. I'm mostly going to use the sculpt in Blender for the larger, cruder details. But let me save here real quick before I do something that might crash the program. Let me see if I can actually get Blender to go to a higher poly count. I'll try one more subdivision here, subdivide. And if I set that to random instead of stencil, what does it do? It does this. So you can create kind of a lumpier scale look there. But certainly the answer to your question is absolutely yes. You can use brushes. You cannot use ZBrush brushes. Those are in a different format. If you have ones that are in the PSD format, let me see if it'll open one of those. I honestly don't know the answer. PSD is a format that ZBrush accepts and Photoshop also accepts. Let me see. For ZBrush, I have ZTL. Here we go. Here's a water surface PSD brush. It's not, I think I have scale ones on here though. Let me see. I have flesh. All right, let's try the pour brush and see if it works. Yes, Blender is tremendously powerful, Liana. She says Blender seems to be able to do a lot of stuff once you learn. It is. It does. It can do a ton of things, but the reason more people don't use it is that more people find it to be, look at that. Wonderful. Blender accepts PSD brushes. So if you have a brush that's made for Photoshop and Alpha, for ZBrush, then it will use your ZBrush alphas. You cannot use a ZBrush tool, a ZTL, but if you have a PSD format brush made for ZBrush or in ZBrush, you certainly can use that in Blender, as I am doing right this second, to paint some scale texture here. So you have some options. If you have ZBrush, but you want to do something in Blender because it can be less destructive for editing than ZBrush is. Sometimes I actually do sculpt in Blender deliberately instead of in ZBrush, usually on a lower polygon project. If you need more than 1 million polygons, you really want to do ZBrush and not Blender, if you possibly can. If 300 to 500,000 is going to be enough for you, looks like, oh, this looks like we're actually up to 1.5 million faces there, which is better than I expected, especially with as many programs as I now have open. There's that. And I will lumpify the inside of the mouth a little bit, but I'm going to turn the strength down and make the brush bigger. Just roughen that very slightly. Roughen the tongue very slightly as well. Get the underside of the tongue like that. Now, geckos have a pretty sizable, I think they have a biggish ridge around the mouth. Yeah, I see those bigger scales right there. I'm going to see if I can do that with my inflate brush again. And no texture, just the brush itself. Liana says she's getting a blurry video. Is anyone else having that problem? No? Oh, bandwidth. Okay. Yeah, bandwidth is always the bugaboo when it comes to streaming things like this. Looks like I need to decrease my spacing there a little bit. maybe increase my size a little bit. Okay, and now I'm making my nice lizardly ridge around the edge of the mouth. It's still mirrored there. I can turn mirroring off if I want to have irregular details, which again, if you're doing something like a human face, can be important. On our gecko, we're probably okay with it being relatively symmetrical. Reptiles tend to have relatively symmetrical bodies, so that's convenient too. And I can ridgify the edge of my tympanum there. Nice. That's pretty close to the effect we want. If you're looking at this and saying it looks too lumpy, bear in mind also that this is going to be a normal map, not a displacement map. So it will be less bumpy in the final version than you're looking at now. If anything, when you know it's going to be a normal map and not a displacement map, you want to exaggerate the bumpiness as much as possible. If it's going to be a displacement map, and this might actually affect the height, the relative height of the final thing, then you might want to be a bit more careful. Let's see. I've used this pour brush on humanoid characters as well, actually, in fact. But in that case, I used it bumped downward, not upward like it is here. And I used it very small, and usually in ZBrush, because again, the higher the poly count that you're working with, the smaller the details you can put onto the mesh. Okay, there's my... Okay, that's not a bad starter normal map for our leopard gecko. Any other questions here about sculpting in Blender before I demonstrate the ZBrush equivalent? I'm going to export that at the full resolution and call it... Actually, I don't even have to do that. If I'm working with Substance Painter, I probably should, though. Let's go sub D Blender. Blender can bake the normal maps itself, but it cannot combine them with Substance Painter brushes. How are we doing so far with this? Is this making sense? Are there questions about the sculpting process here? About the setup?
Okay, I think we're good for now.
All right. So I can, to bake a normal map directly out of Blender if you don't have Substance Painter, I will select all the, hit A, I'll tab into edit mode and hit A to select everything. And then down here in the UV window, I will go to Image and New. And the options here are like blank, UV grid, and color grid. I'm going to go with blank and set it to 2048 by 2048. And I'll call it SY gecko body underscore normal, so that I know it's going to be the normal map. And I'll go ahead and check 32-bit float here, because I don't think I'm going to be editing it afterwards. If you don't have Substance Painter. Christina Cornell says, if you were doing displacement map, would you start with it? Would I start with what? The process of sculpting would be similar to the process of sculpting for a normal map. You just would, with a normal map, the variable depth here matters a little bit less. With a displacement map, it matters more. If it's a displacement map, I can do things like having deeper ridges, and the deepness of this hole and the deepness of the nostrils will show up more. But the method is very similar. Yeah. Does that make sense? Is that what you were asking? Yeah. Usually I don't do displacement maps because they are slower to render in iRay, is why. Okay, yes. If I were, no, I wouldn't, okay. You said, I mentioned starting with normal. I don't mean starting with normal as opposed to starting with displacement. I mean starting with normal as opposed to starting with the diffuse map. You can do the normal and the displacement at basically the same time if you want to use both of those, or if you just want to use displacement, the method's basically the same. So once I've created that new image down here for baking, I can go up here to this little camera icon on the right and scroll down until I find the bake panel. Now, before I do that, I need to go here to the modifier panel, which looks like a wrench, and my sub D. And some of you may recall that I mentioned earlier that the preview needs to be set low to bake. So I'm going to go all the way down to 0, in fact. I may need to go to 1, but I'll find that out in a second. Because when it bakes, it's going to do it based on the difference between the original and the sculpt. So I'm going to go back here to the bake panel, this little camera icon. This is the rendering options, but at the bottom of them, there's the bake options. And I'm going to set the bake mode to normals. And I think I want tangent normals, but let me check here momentarily. And I'm going to click Bake from Multi-Res. I've left a margin of 16 there to help prevent seams. And then I'll just hit Bake and wait for the program to generate my tangent normal map. There it is. That's not bad. You can see the details there that I sculpted. The inside of the eye socket isn't really detailed, but I didn't really do anything to that today. There's the mouth ridge, and there's padding around the seams like we wanted. There's the spots on the limbs. So that's pretty good. So then I will say image and save as image. And I will go to where I have my other items saved in that Gecko directory and runtime textures. And I'm going to say Gecko body norm. I'll go ahead and export it to PNG first. The final version will probably be a JPEG because of file size reasons, but let's try this as a PNG first, see how it looks. In DAZ Studio here, I'll go to the Surfaces tab, and in the Surfaces panel here, I have the list of materials, and I will hold down Control and click on all of these except the eyes, because I didn't do the eyes yet. And then down here where it says Normal Map and Browse, I can then go to the thing that I exported there. And let's see, where is it? There it is, geckobodynorm.png. I'll just click on that. And then if I do an NVIDIA iRay viewport render here, Max is asking what image format DAZ prefers for textures, TGA, JPEG, or PNG. DAZ accepts all of those. Rendering is best with JPEGs. PNGs can actively slow your render down. I'm going to make the base color darker here. And because of the file size, because the graphics card has to load, you have to load all those images onto the graphics card. So the size of the file and the actual like 1024 versus 2048 size affects how long it takes to load images onto the graphics card, which affects how long it takes to render. And Nancy says PNGs make the zip larger too. That's absolutely true. So I made the gecko gray here so you can see the normal map. It's there. It's much less bumpy than the sculpt that I made because it's a normal map. So I can actually go down here and set the normal map to, let's say, max 2 and value 2. Should make it a little more bumpy. There we go. You can see that there's a nostril. And if I scroll around to the side of the head, you can see there's a tympanum. It created, because it's Blender, it created some creases, which is a little annoying. Those can be post-worked out, but I'm not going to do that right this minute. So, texture shaded, back to that. Nancy, how did you increase the normal to 2? She said, okay, over here in the Surfaces tab, sorry about that, I skipped a step. Down here in the Surfaces tab, there's a channel called Normal Map, and once I have clicked on that square and hit Browse and then navigated to where my picture is, I can hit this little gear up here on the right and Parameter Settings. And then in the Parameter Settings, there are these options Min, Max, Default, and Value. And by default, the max is 1, but I set the maximum to 2. And you can set that as high as you want. I can set it up to 5 even. And that allows me to have I'm not even sure what that'll do now. Let's see. That allows a really kind of weird looking normal map, but it might be weird looking because it's in PNG format. I'm not 100% sure. But it does make it lumpier. Okay. Max says, can you use the normal map for displacement as well? No, the displacement map has to be grayscale. You can sort of kludge together a displacement map from the normal map, and I can show you how to do that in the GIMP here. And this will work with any program that can handle channels. So if you want to kludge together a displacement map from the normal map, you open the normal map here in any image program and go to colors and components and decompose, or whatever Photoshop, I don't know what Photoshop uses to decompose channels. But that gives me a version here that has it divided into red, green, and blue. The blue channel is all white there. So I'm just going to go to the red one, which now covers the green one completely, and I'm going to decrease its opacity somewhat to create a consensus map between them. And then I can export that displacement map. Should still have some comparative heights in it. Let's see what that looks like. Now, when you do a displacement map, you have to set the sub-D displacement level. Ideally, you actually need to be set at the level of your sculpt, which was 4 subdivisions, and that's going to be ridiculous in DAZ Studio, so I'm going to set it to 2 for now. And I'll set the maximum to 0.25 and the minimum to negative 0.25 here. And the displacement strength is 1. Let's see how that renders. It doesn't show a lot of detail. I'm going to have to set the sub-D displacement level up a little more. You can see that now it's taking longer to render because it has to handle that subdivision. Okay. There's that. It doesn't look tremendously different from the normal map. It's just a little bit bumpier. Actually, let me set the maximum up to 1 here and see how that does. That doesn't look so good. The problem that we're looking at here is that making displacement from the normal map results in a displacement map that doesn't have enough contrast between the sculpted bits and the rest, and so it's actually bumped out the base of the map. So it may actually be better to instead generate a displacement map in Blender. I'll show you that. So there's this. And down in the bake panel, I can tell it to bake displacement instead of normals and still use bake from multi-res. And when I tell it to bake that, it should create a grayscale map. Yep, there it is. See that? And it looks somewhat different from the one we created by kludging with the normal map. So let's see how that looks. I'll just overwrite that JPEG that I exported before. And I'll set the quality to 100. Okay, and then I need to go up here and hit Refresh Images on the Surfaces tab. I'll go up to this little tiny button, click on that, and hit Refresh Images. And then I'll try that render again, see if that looks better. Still pretty lumpy. Let's go for a -1 value. Better, but not great. At least you can see that the bumps are standing out more visibly, and the tympanum and nostril are popped in a little more. So that's how you do a displacement in Blender. Turn that off for now. So now I'm going to show you how to do that same thing in ZBrush. So here in ZBrush, I'm going to import and I'm going to go back to that same thing that I exported with no eyeballs in it and the mouth open. So I think it's called Gecko for Substance Painter. When I say import, nothing appears in the main window here. It's over here, and it's created what's called a tool in ZBrush. So I have to click and drag to draw that tool into ZBrush. Now, don't do anything after this or your entire thing will be ruined. Up here to the left part of the upper part of the screen and click on Edit Object. If you do literally anything else before you click on Edit, your project is ruined and you have to start over because it immediately decides your image is 2D and won't let you do any of the 3D things if you do that. ZBrush has actually just as quirky an interface as Blender. It's just more popular because nothing else can do what ZBrush does in the same way. So you can see this is our low poly gecko. It's unsubdivided. So to subdivide that, I'm going to go to the geometry panel here in ZBrush and click divide. And I'm going to divide it a few times here. I might actually give it even 5. That puts me at 1.26 million pixels, million polygons, not pixels. That looks relatively smooth there. So then I'm ready to be painting my lumpy things again. Over here on the left, the standard brush is pretty good for most things. The stroke here is set to dots. When I want those dots to be spaced, I'm going to have to go up to, let's see, stroke here, and lazy mouse. And I'm going to set, let's see, I think it's lazy step that we want to more than 1. Let's see what that does. You still use the brackets to make the brush bigger or smaller. You can change intensity up here on this bar at the top. It's set to Z add right now. Z sub subtracts, Z add adds, makes it bigger. There's the intensity, and then the draw size you can also set with the dial. I usually set it with brackets because it's faster. So then the brush is too large, looks like. If I want to have
Brush
my
large, small,
symmetry again,
yeah.
I need to go up here to transform and then activate symmetry. And X is what it is by default, and I'm going to leave it at that. So I think X is what we want here. Okay. So I want that to be bumpier and further spaced. So I'm going back to my stroke panel here and setting lazy step to 1.6. There we go. There's some bumps. Make the little bumps with that. And when I'm ready for the bigger ones, I will probably increase the spacing again. And then when you're ready to draw with a brush in ZBrush, you go over here to this panel that's called Alpha.
Alpha.
And there are some alphas you can use by default. This one looks vaguely scaly, and it ends up in a lot of people's projects. I need to turn the spacing off to use a fill one here. So I'll go back to stroke and turn off lazy mouse and just leave it on dots and maybe make that a little bigger. That's way too lumpy. So then we're going to turn the intensity way down. Maybe even just use individual little clicks there to make that pattern. That's more of an alligator looking scale pattern. That's not what I want. So I'm going to import my own alpha. I'm going to use that same one that I used in Blender. But to do that, I'm going to click on alpha and choose import. It needs to be a PSD here. It doesn't work well with PNG files in ZBrush. Let's see. That's right, I saved it in the webinar folder. That actually is a PNG, and it actually is working all right. Still a little, I think I want that bumped up instead of down. You're listening to me sort of figuring this out as I go along, and that's how it is on every project because every project is different. Here I'm clicking along like this. I'm doing this click by click here. It's faster to do it using something like the lazy mouse, so I use the lazy mouse quite a lot. Like so. Makes a neater stroke. as I create the scale pattern to cover the smoother parts of the gecko. And this is a little bit faster and easier to use in ZBrush than in Blender. ZBrush is pretty much the industry standard for this sort of work, for this sort of sculpt, because it can handle those higher poly counts with much less lag than most programs. But there are many programs that can do something like this. Usually you are going to need a 3D program, even if it's just a free one like Blender. I don't think even Photoshop, even the newer ones, can do this. There are ones that can do some kind of 3D painting. If I need to smooth something out by accident, like you can see that I've gotten some scales in the mouth there, I can hold down the Shift key and use that to smooth, like so. And then for the inside of the mouth, I might use a different alpha here that's just a little generic noise, like this bunch of little dots here. Or even this right here actually looks a little bit like the texture of the inside of a mouth. So I'll just bump that out a little bit in there, like that. Are there any questions about the ZBrush version of this sculpting process for creating our normal map? Oh yeah, ZBrush Core. I think ZBrush Core allows you to do most of what I'm doing. I don't have that, so I can't directly speak to it. But I think it has a lot of the features. Some nostrils, got a tympanum there. Okay, so when we're ready to export this to Wavefront again, I'll go up here and I'll hit Export on the tool panel on the top right. In ZBrush, you can save this. You don't save the document like in other programs, you save the tool. So for the tool, you click Save As, and I already have one there from the previous run-through that I did myself. So I'll say ZBrush Tool 2. And I'll click Save. Then I don't lose my work. And I'm going to export to Wavefront. I called that Gecko High Res there. I'm going to call it Gecko High Res 2 in this case. And I can also directly export to normal map from this. In this case, I'm going to use the Z plugin up here on the dialog. Oh yeah, I'm waiting for it to finish writing the OBJ. There we go. ZBrush doesn't like it if you tab away from it while it's exporting. It will actually stop exporting until you come back. It's kind of a prima donna that way. So even if it takes a while to export the normal maps, you have to leave ZBrush up while it's doing that and not do anything else. Very irritating, but necessary. So here on the I clicked on the multi-map exporter here. And you can export displacement, vector displacement, normal maps. Texture from PolyPaint usually means the diffuse texture, which I don't usually do that part in ZBrush, but you can. Here I've just clicked normal, and I've got the map size down here set to 2048. There are buttons you can click for the most common sizes there. The map border is at 8, and then I'm going to click Create All Maps. And I've got some ZBrush export options here. And I'm just going to leave it with a stupid, not great name, and it automatically exports to TIFF. You can actually use TIFFs in DAZ Studio again, but again, I don't do that normally because they are very large files. I'm going to change that to JPEG normally again. So let's look at how that one came out from Webinar Dev, from ZBrush Export. And let's see, look at our gecko normal map. And just irate it. I don't like doing displacement maps from ZBrush either because it tends to create seams that I don't want. And this is a better looking normal map in less time than we got with Blender, which is why I recommend, if you're on zero budget, you can start with Blender, but save up and get Substance Painter and then save up and get ZBrush from your first few products as fast as you can. Highly recommended. Because look how much better that looks. And with so little effort that we had to do to get it that way. Okay, so any questions about the ZBrush method before I go on to Substance Painter?
Think of any questions as well to do with your own projects that you have in mind. I know some of you have got furry creatures in mind. We had a squirrel project mentioned yesterday. Non-furry, because I guess that's not our discipline today.
Now, you can actually paint fur on the normal map. That's not usually going to be realistic enough in close-up, but it's certainly possible to do that. I think ZBrush actually has a brush that works decently for that. Let me check that here. I'm going to re-import this and briefly paint a hairy gecko as I try to re-import a wavefront here.
So
sometimes ZBrush is a little uncooperative.
She's answering my question.
But I'm used to that because I'm used to Blender, which is also somewhat uncooperative. There we go. That's a version that still has eyeballs, but never mind. Over here in the alphas, where is that brush? Here it is, alpha 58. Set that to Z sub. Actually, Z add. Let's see how it looks on Z add. Set the intensity pretty high. Yeah, you can make sort of a furry look with that. If you're doing a small creature and you aren't able to do particle fur. And particle fur is something you can do in ZBrush, but that's its own entire area that I'm not expert in, so I'm not going to be covering that today. Doing a chicken. That's tougher. We don't have a great way to do feathers. In that case, you're probably just going to have to paint it on the body as best you can. So I'm going to go ahead and close ZBrush entirely there. And I'm going to go back to Substance Painter. And the reason I had us go through all that and export the actual wavefront instead of just the normal map is that I'm actually going to bake the normal map here in Substance Painter, and then when Substance Painter adds brushes, it will actually add Substance Painter's textures to the normal map, and I can re-export it and combine them, which is a really nice feature. So in order to do that, I need to click on the Bake Textures option here on this Texture Set Settings panel in Substance Painter. So that comes up with this, and I'm going to set the output size to 2048. And then I'll go down and click on this little piece of paper icon, and it will let me navigate to the high definition mesh, which I believe I put in the webinar dev folders. Yes. That one's already generated. Gecko high res. And I'm going to say bake all texture sets there. It'll take a minute as it tries to do that. I'm not sure if I'll get an error or not with that one because I don't remember if it had eyeballs in the original version I had or not. Let's see what it does. But you can see it's baking the normal map from ZBrush there into the file in Substance Painter. And it generates other things like a curvature map that we're not going to use today, but it generates other kinds of maps from that Substance Painter uses itself, and that some, for example, game engines also use, like world space normals and thickness maps and things like that. Yep, that doesn't look right because that one had eyeballs on it. So I'm going to redo the bake here real quick with a different sculpt, the one that we just did, High Res 2. Substance Painter uses the same sort of brushes and the same sort of level setup, layer setup, as 3D Coat, as Photoshop, as ZBrush, and as Blender when it comes to actually painting things. A certain sort of doctrine for that exists across several different kinds of programs, so once you're used to the whole concept of layers and brushes, you can step into a lot of different 3D programs and be ready to go in just a few minutes. So it's definitely a strong advantage to learn that in some 3D program early on, and then you've only got to find where in the program the brush dialog and the layers dialog are located, and you're pretty much good to go. I mean, every program has other features that you need to learn, but those are the basics. There we go, that's better. Okay. So there's that we exported. Now, to create my diffuse map, I am going to first create a flooded background layer that's just sort of yellowish. You can see that the leopard gecko is kind of yellowish on top and white on the lower half. Whitish, like sort of an off-white yellowish color. So I'm going to flood with that off-white yellowish color, and then I'm going to paint over the top with a yellowish color, and then I'm going to probably use a photo resource for the spots. So I'm going to go ahead, and up here, this distinguishes in Substance Painter, there are regular layers and there are fill layers. You can't paint on a fill layer, you can only paint on a regular layer. But the fill layer there, it automatically just filled the whole thing, you can see with that white color. And then you change the color over here on the right under the Properties panel. See, it says Base Color, Uniform Color. And I can actually click around in this Base Color Options thingy here to change that. I'm just working with the tongue there, which I don't necessarily want to do. The tongue and the mouth, I want to both be pinkish even, so I'm going to tint that sort of this off pink color. And I have a dropper here. But to get the same color on the mouth and tongue, I'm probably going to have to go down and note the hue saturation value thing. So that's 0, 332, and 338. So then I will go to the mouth and fill, and I can type in those values. Oops. Hey, just discovered that, guys. Hitting tab hides that menu. How about that? Okay, now the mouth and tongue are pinkish. Like, I can actually move this layer up on the tongue, because in my source pictures, one of my source pictures, I noticed that the tip of the tongue is usually kind of reddish with geckos. So I can actually have this layer here for painting, and I'll go down to the paint properties and scroll down here to the base color and make it more darkish, sort of a darkish red type color. And then if I go to the shelf down here below the 3D window there, I have several options here, but the one I want is, I think, brushes. And you can see it has all these brushes, and it shows them in a zigzag to show you what the stroke will look like. So yeah, I'm going to use probably the Artistic 1 brush here. Scroll in and just redden up the tongue. And you can see that when I hold down the mouse, it is hiding every material zone except the one that I'm working on. And it won't paint on any of the other zones by accident either, which is nice. Okay, so there's our gecko's pink mouth and red tongue. For the gecko base, which is the body, I am going to make that off-white fill layer there before we get to the photo painting. which I'm sure is probably what most of you came to see. Little bit off-white. There we go. And then I'll create another fill layer, but this one will have a mask. And I'm going to add a black mask, which completely hides that layer. Because I want to paint on the mask with white to reveal the yellow color that I'm going to put on that layer. So I will click on the mask here, which is black. And the options to paint on it are pretty much just black and white. So then when I paint in the scene, I'm painting yellow, but the yellow is actually already there. I'm just painting the mask to reveal it. And I can refer back to my photo resources to try to get an idea how far down the yellow comes there. Different geckos. This will serve as a rough guide when I start stenciling or painting from the photos, as I will momentarily.
Ted asks, can a mask be imported?
Now I don't know actually the answer to that. Let me check. Let me fiddle around here in Substance Painter with that. So Substance Painter can generate its own masks. It actually has an entire smart mask panel down here, but those are generated based on the shape of the model. Like if I put the Dirt Complex model on there, mask on there, it now makes it sort of irregular. Control Z that. So let's see here. If I right click on the mask, let's see what it says. Ah, yes, you can import one. It says add bitmap mask. So to do that, you have to first add a texture to the shelf, and I will show you how to do that, because we're going to need one for our painting process that comes next. Yes, Nancy, sorry, I missed that you said that, but yeah, you can use a bitmap mask. So I'm going to go to my source pictures again. And I'm just going to put all of those. I can actually hold those down, click and drag them into the texture shelf in Substance Painter. And it will ask what I want them to be, and I will say texture on each of those. And I will import my resources to the current session because I don't want to use them in everything forever. So then let's see if anything like that comes up when I tell it to add a bitmap mask. Nope, those weren't saved as BMP files, so it looks like they're not an option. So you would have to have it actually saved as the BMP file format to use a bitmap mask, but I could click on this one and have it create more of an irregular look to my yellow there. Okay. So then I'm ready to start painting with a photo over this. So I'm going to take those textures that I've got imported now. Got my gecko textures there, they're in my texture shelf. I'm going to create a new non-fill layer. And I am going to go up here and find the button that says projection. Click on that. It gives me the option to scroll down here in the properties and choose a base color for my projection. And I can scroll through until I find the gecko. Or if I know the name of the file, I can type it up here at the top and it will narrow it down. Let's start with this guy here. There we go. So I don't want to paint the eyeball there, paint some spots. I noticed that that's a more vivid yellow-orange than the one that I flooded with. But if I want to change the flood color based on that, I can just click on that and tweak the color again to make it more orange. And the great thing about this is that I can drag the model around here and use the same bit of lizard to paint on it about anywhere. I can go up here and turn it over and paint my tympanum there, where I put the tympanum on the normal map roughly. I'm scrolling in and out to achieve the proper sort of size there. And I think I can actually flip my resource. Let's see if that's an option up here. Ah, I have a tangent wrap option, but I can also have a camera option or a UV option. Let's see. Paul says, would Substance Painter get you further along the road with fur and feathers from the Substance Painter materials library or other features? Well, you can look at, let's look at that actually. I'll go back to paint and I'll hide these layers here. I don't think it has smart materials that are useful for animals for the most part. Substance Painter is strongly oriented toward hard surfaces. It's got a lot of metals and wood and chrome and rubber. Now, it's not impossible to create a smart material. Let's see what we've got in the plain materials section. No, not really. Now, what I could do here is I might be able to create a material in a layer. Let's see if I can do that. Let's go down here and choose. If I already have, I've got this scales image here that I've saved, and I can probably create a generated normal map for that in the GIMP, like here. So to do that, I will go to Filters and Map and Normal Map. This is a plugin, but it's a free plugin that anyone can download. And I will set that to Sobel 3x3, like so, and then export that as same name but norm. And then in Substance Painter, I can drag that texture and its normal map that I've just created onto the texture shelf here. That first one I'm going to say is a texture, and it's not an alpha, so probably still texture on that. And then import those to the current session and import. Now I should be able to go to the brush over here. And I want to use a smoother soft brush. There we go, default soft. And I can set that to base color, and instead of using the flooded color, I can go find that scale thing that I just imported and use it as both a base color and a normal map color to create a material that way. Let me see here. I feel like I've scrolled past it, but I can't find it again. Let's see. There we go. There's the scale one, and for the normal map, there's that. I'm not sure if I need to do that as a fill for it to become a material or not. I might need to. I think I do. Okay, so that doesn't look great as is, but the nice thing about that is that we have the option to change the UV scale here in the properties. So I can make it pretty small, pretty large. And I should be able to rotate it as well. Yes, I can. See that? That's going to be visible at the seams there. But it is possible for me to clone over the seams in this same program if I wish. Change the offset a little if I want. That makes the seams less visible. And then if I want to create a smart material from that, you'll see the eyelids don't look quite right because it's tiled across them, which is why it's often better to use 3D paint than a material. This is really great for things that are not lizards, like when you have a wood, when you want to make wood or a base skin pattern, or maybe even a base, that might work for a base feather pattern actually, now that I think about that. But I can go to the Smart Materials panel. Let's see. And now I can go to this fill layer that I created that has the base color and the normal map there. And I can right click and choose. It doesn't give me the option to create a smart material from that. Maybe if I add a generator, let's see if that does anything. That lets me add shading and dirt. That didn't work well. No, that didn't work great either. Okay, maybe generator layer is not the answer there. I may need to add a folder. Group layers. Let's see if that does it. And I'll name this SY scale so it shows up at the end of my list so I can find it again. There we go. Now it lets me create a smart material. So to create a smart material, you need to have things in a group. And it takes a minute to generate it, but now down here in my Smart Materials panel, it has this and it shows a little preview there based on that. When you're ready to export your textures from Substance Painter, you can go to File and Export Textures, and it will by default export most of the types of things that you can export. I will go to where I want to do that. I actually have this dev folder for exporting things to that are unedited because Substance Painter is going to create a height map and a thickness map and some other things I won't be using. So I'll select that folder and choose the format I want to use, which is JPEG in this case. And make sure 2048 is my document size, and then I'll hit export. And then that process that I just did, I'm just going to repeat all of that with the eyeballs. I'm going to do a normal map for them. I'm going to do a diffuse map for them in basically the same way. Then I can go back to DAZ Studio to the Surfaces tab, and if it doesn't already have the Iray Uber shader, you can find that in your DAZ Studio library under Shader Presets, and it should be under, let's see, something Iray here. Maybe just Iray. Here we go, Iray and DAZ Uber, and the Iray Uber base. Now, if you right-click on this and choose Create Custom Action, it creates an entry up here in scripts, so that's much easier to get to than scrolling through the whole library. So I use that. But once you click on that, it applies the basic shader for Iray over to this here. And you're ready to navigate to where you saved your textures, and you can start loading those. Like there's my base color. That'll be my painted texture that I did. This is one that I painted beforehand rather than the terrible one that you just saw me do part of. And then I'll set the layered weight to 1. I don't use layered weights less than 1 much because the lower the glossy layered weight, the less your glossiness interacts with the scene. People make a mistake there and think that when I turn down the glossy layered weight, I'm just making it less shiny. No, you're making it react less with the lighting of your scene. Don't do that. There are very few situations where that's a good idea. And then I'll set my roughness somewhat low. Do I have a roughness map? I think I don't. No, I don't. I didn't need one. I set the roughness relatively low, the reflectivity a little higher. I've got my separate map for my eyes. There we go. They're brown and slit pupilled because it's a gecko. Actually, let me go ahead and load my scene subset. It has textures and shaders loaded on it. There we go. So for the basic things that you need are the base color and the normal map. A lot of other things can be sort of faked up with the shaders, but you really need both of those to get a good looking result. In this case, for the eyes, I did not make an outer lens as you have with most creatures. I generally would recommend that you do that. So if you have an outer lens, generally you're going to want that to be transparent. So you're going to use refraction and the refraction weight and set that to 1 and then set the refraction index to like 1.38 or thereabouts, which is approximately the refraction index of a human eye. Most creatures have a refraction index of something like that for their lens and cornea. And then I believe I added a top coat. I did. I added a small top coat for the gecko's base, just to make it a little more slick looking, make the body a little slicker. And I made the glossy roughness actually relatively high because the roughness controls how big the highlights are. The lower the roughness is, the smaller the highlights are. And I wanted bigger highlights, but I still wanted it to look kind of slick. So adding a top coat a little bit gives me a way to do that. And then do an iris render there. Now you can see my diffuse map showing up and my bumpy normal map that we created. The scene's a little bit overlit here. So I'm going to turn off the headlamp. That's better. And there's my textured gecko. If you want to go with a different diffused map but not have to redo all of that manual painting, sometimes what you can do is in the GIMP, you can, or Photoshop X2, you can open the exported diffuse map that was created in your paint program. And I can exclude the pink bits here with I might duplicate this, duplicate layer in my layers dialog, and add layer mask and white. And then I'm going to select the pink and red colors here because I don't want to retint my entire mouth, my entire body. Like I just want to retint the body, not the mouth and the tongue. So I'm going to use select by there. And then when I've selected my pink and red colors, I'll go up here and fill that with black in those areas. So that you can see it sort of cut those out. And then I'm going to do colors and invert on that mask. So now functionally I have this upper layer that is, there we go. And I can I can click on the mask there on the right and paint out with black the area where it selected a bit of the body as well that I don't want. Just sort of paint around that to make those disappear. Then I will turn back on the layer below that, and I can go to color tools and hue saturation and change my hues around to get a different colored gecko, the spot pattern won't change, but you can use that to retint it and get a different colored diffuse without affecting the mouth colors, for example. Okay, questions. Do you paint with Substance Painter more than with GIMP in most of your projects? All of my projects, every single one. I paint in 3D rather than 2D as much as possible, because if you paint in the GIMP, you have to deal with the seams. Painting in a 3D program allows you to just paint right over seams without having to worry about it. I do not ever do manual seam touch-up, ever. I literally only do that in 3D Code or Substance Painter. I use the GIMP for doing things like tints, or if I have a particular patch on the thing where I feel like I need to add more detail, like I feel like the tympanum doesn't look right or something. Nancy says, where is the clone function button in Substance Painter? You access the clone function. You can only use clone on a paint layer, not on a fill layer at the present time. And at the present time, Substance Painter does not appear to have a way to convert between fill and paint, unfortunately. 3D Code does have a functionality like that, but Substance Painter does not. So you click on this little button up here that says Clone Tool, and then you find the place you want to clone from on your model and hold down V, click on the place you want to clone from, and then you move to where you want to paint, and you just paint, and it'll follow the direction of your stroke. And you can relocate the place you clone from by, again, moving your cursor to there, holding down V,
it's fun
and
watching
clicking,
somebody work, isn't it?
and then you
As they
just
talk.
keep cloning like that to cover up seams or whatever you like. I believe that Max or someone had another question that I didn't get to because the screen freeze happened.
Yeah, let me get to that. So Max says,
Okay.
do you paint directly on the UV map view in Substance Painter?
You mean, is there like a two-dimensional view? Is that... I don't think that there is. Generally, if you want to paint directly onto a UV template, you're going to use the GIMP like that.
I think he's kind of comparing it like in 3D Code.
Yes, it is similar to the way 3D Code works. I like Substance Painter better because it has this normal map combining feature. Like, if I add a dirt layer, let's see. Some of the smart materials and fill layers and masks add lumpiness to them. Let's see, I'm gonna add that. Add a mask. Whoops. Add a black mask. And then down here in the smart masks, I can add something like a damages one. And now I have a dirty gecko. And the dirt is generated kind of in the creases of the normal map there, like that. That is a fantastic functionality that almost nothing does except Substance Painter. So having access to that is the reason that I often use Substance Painter instead of 3D Code. But there absolutely are things that are easier to do in 3D Code. Sometimes I use 3D Code for diffuse painting for that reason. But yes, they do have a lot of similar functions. Max, good question. Are there other questions about any of this texture process, any of it?
Yeah, I was going to ask you about how did you approach texturing the eyes? You know, what resources or what approaches did you do? Because when you first look at an eye texture, you think, oh goodness me, how do I replicate that from my reference? Because it looks kind of complex.
It is, and in that particular case, I believe I freehanded part of it. Let me see here. Look what I did. Let me look what I did. Eyes. So I did a base fill in. I just filled it with brown there, but then I used an exported UV template. Let me find my eyeballs here in Blender. To do that in Blender, in the UV screen here, you use UVs, and export UV layout. And create a template subfolder in the Blender area usually. Let's see, and I will call that SY Gecko Eye template and export it at 2048 and fill opacity of 1. And then I will open that template in the GIMP or in Photoshop. Just like so. With the eye, I did paint a normal map so that I would have little veiny looking things covering the edge areas. And I believe I used the normal map that I painted in 3D as a guide to the shape of the 2D map. So let me find the normal map that I exported. It just has little veiny things on it. Here we go, eye norm. There it is, my eyeball normal map. And the eyeball normal map also told me that the placement of the slits, that they needed to be slanted there. So I made a new layer for that, put that there, made another layer, put this tan color, brown color on it, that. And I then turned down the opacity of this normal map layer so I can see the UV map and make sure I don't paint over the edges. The brown went away. I can also hit O and do a medicine dropper thing, and that'll pick that up as a fill option. And then I can
I think I've realised my question is a good one, because it's a can of worms in itself, the eye, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. The eye is in a very important area. And in this case, I believe that I actually, let me find the final diffuse version and how that turned out here. Yep, it looks like I actually painted that pretty much manually. So I took a brush that has sort of a spray look to it, and could be one of these. And I turned it a darker brown, and then I just sort of sprayed on the next layer. This is one of those cases where I did use the 2D program for this sort of thing.
I would quite fancy a webinar in the future at some point just on eyes, because I think in an artistic sense, whether it's a creature or a human model, that's where much of our attention is placed, isn't it? We're looking at those eyes in quite a lot of detail.
That's very true. I don't know if I am the right one to do that webinar, because I am certainly not the most expert at dealing with the eye, but I have done it a few times for my creature project, so I do know some things about that. What I did here was I used sort of a confetti spray with a darker brown to create the speckles, and then I believe I duplicated the normal map and grayscaled it. And let's see, color, desaturate, there we go. And then I actually made a layer mask that was black, and I painted with white to just reveal that slit area. And blended around that as best I could, basically. That's the sort of thing that I did. And that's why I've got this sort of gray-black blended pupil here, because when I looked at a close-up on the eye of the gecko, you use a lot of references for the eye, because the eye is actually a very small but very detailed area. You can see the gecko has a lighter area around the black pupil, and it also has all these striations in it. And every species of creature and every species of gecko has a slightly different looking eye. So I suppose there probably is enough material there for a webinar now that we're talking about, because I haven't even gotten into we're dealing with your lens and your sort of corneal issues.
Yeah, reflective material.
Yeah. So that is actually a good question, Nancy. She said, did I make my normal map in Substance Painter or Blender? On the eye, I made it in I make it in ZBrush. I do most of my normal maps in ZBrush. Christine asked if I would model or texture to create an inner eyelid. I would do that in the model, because if you want an inner eyelid, you want to be able to pull it across to indicate that the creature is. Cats are under general anesthesia, like at a vet's office. Their inner eyelid is often visible, or when they're badly injured, or when they're ill. So I would definitely choose to model that if I felt it was going to be important in future. Birds have not visible. Usually it's like inside the lens even, but that's different from other creatures. Feathers on a chicken. If so, could you use Substance Painter to paint where feathers go? You could certainly use Substance Painter to paint background there, but Ultra Scatter, I don't know if it would be a good choice there. It actually has a feature that allows you to scatter things across a surface here. Let me demonstrate that real quick. It might, Blender's option might actually be better for that. I've got a cube here. I'm just going to use the cube. And I will, let's see, where is that? I believe it's the array modifier. It might be the array modifier that I want. Let's try object offset. No, it doesn't appear to be object offset that I want. And I don't want a fixed count. I want to fit the length of the thing. That didn't do it. So the array modifier is not what I want. There's another option in Blender that allows you to duplicate an object to every face or every vertex of the thing that you're looking at. Let's see, is it under constraints? I use it with particles a lot, and particles are another thing you might reasonably be able to use for that. Like in the particles panel, you get a new particle system, and then I would scroll down here to object and make little cube 2 the object there, and rotation, and I don't actually want the system on the cube, I want the system on the gecko. But I do want the object to be the cube. So that's the little 4 stars panel here. And set the object to my cube. And now you can already see it's trying to generate cubes spitting off of the surface here. I actually kind of want those to stick to my gecko. So to do that, I will go up here to the options and choose a short lifetime, like maybe 10. And let's see here, a very low velocity. And I'll put, for normal, I'll put like 0.1. And then I would go down to the timeline in Blender, go back to 1 and hit play. And it does kind of generate some things there. They're disappearing because the lifetime of them is very short. So I probably want to, maybe I do want to set the lifetime higher. Make that, say, 50,000. That's not great for feathers because it would create them in more of a random arrangement, but when you've got if you want a bunch of small objects sticking to something, and the alignment of them doesn't matter quite as much as it does with feathers, this might not be a bad choice. The particle system. Let's see, with rotation, you might be able to control that using the hair option. Let's see if it does that. Still falling downward. But I have a YouTube video, I think, dealing with the particle system. If I don't, I can certainly create one. Particles are a whole different subject area, really. Yes, gravity. Gravity is something we can control in the sim here under, I think, field weights. Yes, it is. So I can set the gravity to basically nothing. But there is a way to make the particles stick to the thing they're emitted from, and not just by using the gravity. But that is one way to sort of get that effect. Are there any other questions?
I do have another question from Max, but I believe it'll be a little complex. Let me know if it should be dealt outside the webinar or not. So Max says, I have a question more about yesterday's session to do with character planning. I'm thinking about making a flying squirrel. What about flabby parts between joints, like wing-like parts that need to expand and retract? Is that even possible with DAZ Studio?
Yes, it is. It is difficult, but it is possible. In that case, what you would do is you need to model the squirrel in the maximum spread position. And you are going to have to do joint controlled morphs for literally every position of the squirrel's limbs. So it's going to be very difficult. It's not technically impossible. I don't know that I would really attempt that with the technology that we have now. It might even be better to model a squirrel without the webby bits and then do a geograft and have the flappy bits be D-force. Because if you do a geograft, then you can treat it as a piece of clothing and you can apply a D-force sim to it. You might even be able, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, you know what? Let's check this real quick here in DAZ Studio with our gecko, because it's going to look stupid with the gecko, but it's still a valid way to test this. I think that you can just apply D-force to a living creature and just isolate which part of the creature is affected. So I'm going to try adding D-force to the gecko's tail here. This is a fun little experiment. I love doing little experiments. That's why I have a job, actually, to figure out new workflows that way. All right, so I've got my gecko. I'm going to go to the simulation settings panel and D-force and add dynamic surface. And I need to create a D-force modifier weight node from the create panel here, because I want to have only the tail affected. So then I'm going to go Alt-Shift-W to my weights panel here, the node weight map brush tool, sorry. And the only option here is add map and D-force simulation weights, so I'll do that. Now by default, you can see the entire gecko is affected, and we want just the tail. So I'm going to use marquee selection here, and that doesn't work in the weight map brush. I'll have to go back to geometry editor. Here we go. In the geometry editor, I will select everything except that tail. And then I can go to the node weight map brush and fill selected with 0. And smooth that a little bit, as we talked about doing yesterday. He's asking, Chris says, so maybe the DAZ Dragon Wings would work. Actually, that's possible. This is a method that might work with the DAZ Dragon Wings. I don't know if it's been tried. But, so now I've got a tail that's dynamic and nothing else. And I'm going to turn off start from memorized pose, and I'm going to go to the surfaces tab because it adds D-force to all of my surfaces. So I'm going to go to the eyes and mouth and tongue, and I'm going to go to D-force here and turn off. I'm going to set the dynamic strength all the way down to 0. And then for the gecko base, I'm going to set, I'm going to set the dynamic strength to less than 100% so that it won't just completely collapse the tail.
80%, but 70%.
And maybe set the buckling stiffness and set some of the stiffness higher.
I understand.
See how that does. And then I will go to the simulation settings here and click simulate and cross our fingers and hope for luck. It didn't do much of anything there. Maybe I need to go back to the base and turn the strength up higher. Let's try again. There we go. So the tail is simulating there. The tail did collapse just a little bit. And I can control how much it collapses by increasing or decreasing the dynamic strength. And by having the stiffness higher or lower. See, look at that. Look at that. Ha! That'll totally work with your squirrel wings. You don't even have to have them be a geograph. You can just mesh. You still need to mesh the creature with the wings at maximum spread, so you have enough geometry. But you could actually use D-Force to create your flying squirrel wings. And then people could simulate the wings in the poses where it has the arms close to the body. It's going to make it dependent on D-Force, but trying to do that with just joint controls is going to be really difficult. The dragon wings, the Daz dragon wings, when they fold closed, those only work folding open and closed because they have joint controls for like every bend of the wings. It's a pretty complex setup. With D-Force, that would be actually somewhat easier. So I'm actually really glad you asked that question. We've found an exciting answer for your squirrel wings or to any other floppy bits of a creature.
So is this what you would call a technical first for this idea?
I believe it is. I have not yet seen anyone using this technology in this way.
Ted says Dragon 4.
I hope so. That would be great. I'm excited about that. I'm gonna have to go back to my tentacle beasties and see if this works on them. Like you could do something like this where I've rigged the gecko's tail so it can move, but you could like pose it and then apply D-Force to it to make it sort of flop into a squishier shape. And that's probably the best usage of it, is to have some bones for posing and then D-Force for the squishier or membranous bits, like on a tongue or a tail or wings. Or yes, Christine says for your octopus's mantle. Good idea. Yeah, this is very exciting. What a fun idea we've come up with, chat. What a great question. Yes, I recommend that you do learn D-Force.
We have a D-Force, well, it's more to do with cloth webinar coming up.
If you can learn to use it with cloth, though, you will then have a good foundation for using it on a creature. So that's still a really good idea to do that. Okay, I'm so happy. We went the full 2 hours today, guys.
Yeah.
And it's been an exciting trip. So, any more questions today?
Vicky, says about seeing a full session concentrating on eyes. Yeah, I think that would be a really fascinating topic, actually. Especially to do with the design side of eyes as well, considering different types of eyes. Yeah. So we'll consider that. I may speak to Shayla. Could make it a multi-artist session and talk to different vendors who do different types of eyes. Yeah, thanks for your questions today, guys. We've come up with a kind of invention at the end as well, which is, I think, a first for one of our webinars.
Hooray!
Yeah.
I'm so excited about that.
Fantastic.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thanks for being a great group of students.
And hopefully we'll see you again. All right. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.